Hello, guys. We're going live. Usually I like to wait for a few people to show up, but we have a lot to cover today.
We do.
Yeah.
Some interesting developments over the last few days.
Yes, two big developments. We'll do some introductions as we hopefully wait for at least one person to show up. I'm sure somebody will probably come in. So Jacob and I were both here for the latest development in the Valerie Haney case. And of course, Valerie Haney is suing Scientology for harassment, for stalking, for a myriad of other issues, and it keeps getting kicked back down to religious arbitration. So there was an attempt in this hearing to try to get some answers, and Scientology wanted to continue with arbitration and kick the can down the road. So Jacob, what happened? What's your general summary of what happened?
Well, the Judge Gail Kellifer, essentially stuck to what she has said in the past, which is that there's not much that she can do, and that this case, his name, controlling the dog, in that there's not much that she can do because Valerie has signed a contract that she will not sue the church, and that any grievances that she has with the church will be handled internally. So what has happened so far in this case is that since Valerie, who is an ex-Scientologist and ex-Sea Org member, filed this lawsuit in 2019, Scientology has pulled out the contract that she signed while she was in, that all disputes would be handled internally. The judge said a contract is a contract, this is out of my hands, and Scientology has now subjected Valerie to a total of 5 days so far of intense interrogations and verbal attacks, for which she has not been allowed to have an attorney present. She has not been allowed to record or have any kind of official transcript taken. She has only been able to take handwritten notes. So now at today's hearing, today was what was called a post-arbitration status conference. And the idea here is that this is an opportunity, even though the judge has ruled that this case is outside of her hands and it will be handled outside of the courtroom, this is an opportunity for the attorneys to present anything that they have to present to the judge and talk about next steps. So Scientology, before today's hearing, had moved for conducting an additional 5 days of arbitration without having indicated that the arbitration will be over by that point, or without giving any kind of an end date. Now, Valerie's attorney, Graham Barry, submitted some filings of his own with information about Valerie's recollection of what happened over the course of the 5 days of arbitration that she's been through. And some notable things that he included are that some of the arbitrators who are on the panel, and I use the word arbitration because that's the word that's being used in the courtroom, but the reality is this is not an arbitration because it's completely biased against Valerie. All of the arbitrators who are on the panel must be Scientologists in good standing, while meanwhile Valerie is now a declared suppressive person, an enemy of Scientology.
So the whole thing's a moot point, but the judge didn't kind of see it that way, I guess, today.
Exactly.
Which is disappointing.
So the judge, as Dodge said, the 5 days of arbitration have already gone by. Scientology's moved for an additional 5 days, and Valerie's attorneys have sought to prove to the judge that this is a sham. This is totally unjust what Valerie's being put through. Valerie is suing for the abuse that she experienced while she was in the church, and now she's being forced to sit across from and be interrogated by some of those very same people who were facilitating her abuse while she was in. So I was really hoping that the judge was going to see through some of the sham that is Scientology's quote-unquote religious arbitration, but unfortunately she said a lot of paperwork was submitted by counsel in this case, even though there's not much that I can do with it. Now, Graham Barry did attempt to say, well, under the Arbitration Act, even if there's not much that you can do today, would you at least be able to set a deadline for when Scientology has to have this resolved by? Because even then, if that did mean that Valerie's going to be subjected to more days of arbitration, it would be progress if we could at least know that we have an end date by which this will be over. By that point, Valerie would be able to appeal once this is over and have the decision potentially overturned and potentially revive the case to bring it
out
back
of arbitration, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And finally to say, and that's the thing, and that's the bummer. You think that after Valerie had already undergone this arbitration. The arbitration has proven to be completely dissimilar to the usual religious arbitration, where maybe that person would be honestly heard out, the bad actors would be investigated, they'd be addressed, they'd be admonished. But instead, it's like she almost goes through this torture process. And there's even been some press, quite a bit of press, including a piece in the Daily Beast about some of the insane tactics that Scientology has employed, which includes stalking her search history, screaming at her face. I mean, why do you think this judge is kind of being so flippant with all of this and not even, I guess this wasn't even the time to bring up the specifics of what the arbitration is. But that's the tragedy, right? Because the judge doesn't care about the specifics. The judge just says, "Okay, you still have that more time."
Well, and part of the thing is because Valerie is not able to have an attorney or have a recording of anything that happens, the only thing that she has is her own handwritten notes, and Scientology's attorneys in their filings that they submitted before today just wrote all of that off as hearsay. Because there's no official court reporter, because nobody is under oath, it's not that kind of a proceeding. None of the things that are happening in these proceedings are able to be, or at least the judge is not interpreting them as anything that she can rule on, and Scientology is holding the judge to that you have no authority over this case. This case is being heard outside of the courtroom, and I was hoping that the judge would maybe give some pushback on that, and at the very least, give them an end date for when this can all be resolved by, but unfortunately, the only real outcome that we got from the judge about what next steps are is that 8 months from now, in February of 2025, there will be an additional hearing, another, do they call it a case management conference or a status conference? Yeah, status conference. But it's unclear if we may be in the very same position we are in today 8 months from now, because Valerie could very well be subjected to another 5 days of interrogation, and Scientology can just say, we're not done.
Right.
So as far as what it's going to take to achieve some actual justice in this case, right now, I'm just not sure.
You know, and it's frustrating because as Jacob realized this as well, we were both in court, in a different case, maybe 2 minutes before the Valerie case showed up, the judge said, "I thought arbitration was supposed to gain a speedy result." And so she said, "Well, this is what arbitration is supposed to do," and yet she negates herself 2 cases later. And so that it's not looking. I mean, do you think it's hard to tell? But like, for example, Judge Olmedo, you could tell, did not take any of Scientology's BS. She was still impartial, but she seemed to have enough of an education about Scientology where she made sure everybody was heard, and therefore I think that was helpful in getting the prosecution. Do you see the attitude of this judge one direction or another this early on? Do you think she's pretty much flippant and doesn't know anything about Scientology and it's just going to be a slog? Or do you think she might have some base of knowledge where, because really to be an objective judge, you have to have a unique base of knowledge about Scientology. But what do you think? Or is it too soon to say?
It's a tough question to tackle, because the truth is today was my first time actually seeing Judge Gail Killefer.
Brand new.
Action.
Right.
So it's my first time actually seeing her operate. It did seem like with all of the other cases that came before us, she was getting through them fairly quickly. But when it came time to talk about Valerie's case, it just seemed that she was very, very disciplined with herself about not changing the rule of the law or interpreting. How do I want to say this? She seems to be very hardline on the issue of a contract is a contract. Valerie signed a contract, that contract must be followed, and she didn't seem to indicate that she had much wiggle room for interpretation or.
But that's why I think this judge is so disappointing, because like if the judge knew about the billion-year contract, the judge would just negate any type of Scientology, any type of contract that Scientology gives out. They're all invalid. It's like, Scientology also made an 8-year-old, like Laura, for example, Lara, like sign a billion-year contract. And so I'm deeply fearful when the judge doesn't have this unique base of knowledge. It's like on May 29th with the other case, I was freaked out simply because the judge said David Miscavige. And I'm like, and I hate to say it, but I wonder if all of the anti-Scientology lawsuits, is just going to be put forth a bunch of flippant people who think that Scientology behaves the same way as everybody else, and they're woefully or perhaps even willfully ignorant. But I don't know. That was just my little rant. But
no, and I totally understand your frustration there. And I mean, obviously, we want a judge who's going to be fair. We want a judge who's going to...
They have to be impartial.
Yeah, and who's going to be following the law and not giving wiggle room to those who don't deserve it.
Right.
But this, with Scientology cases, and particularly when it comes to contracts that have been signed under duress, I really wish that there was more of a precedent in the law to maybe have a little bit of room to take a step back and look at a contract and say, okay, yes, contract is a contract and she signed a contract, but let's look at the circumstances that led up to her signing this contract.
Right.
Did she have adequate time to read through the details of the contract? Did she know what she was signing into?
Right.
And unfortunately, it just hasn't looked like the judge in this case has really shown much interest in trying to take the time to do that.
Right. Hey, sorry, my dog's going crazy. Right, and that's the problem. It's like the judge has shown very little, and it's like what these judges need to realize is that Scientology does not behave the same way as other we wouldn't even call them religion, but Scientology doesn't behave in their arbitration or through any other machination the same way that other religions behave. And so the fact they say, well, I need to treat this religion the same as I treat the way the Catholic religion. Hey! Sorry, my dog's. The way I treat the Catholic religion or the way I treat, Protestants or whatever, it's a completely different ballgame. And the way they arbitrate people revokes their civil liberties and interferes with their judicial process and their due process. When you're screaming at somebody and invading their search history, and also yelling at them for going to the press and telling their story, that's all stuff that is completely out of the realm of what reasonable arbitration would be considered. The last thing is there any encouragement that this is at least in the court system, or is it possible that the judge says arbitrate more, and then after the fifth time the judge says, well, I gave you 5 times to arbitrate, I'm done with this? Or will she be like, you y'alls are crazy, this is the details of what the arbitration is. Finally, Valerie, let's move it. Or impossible to say, I bet. But what's your feeling?
I'm unfortunately not feeling hopeful right now that the judge is going to change her mindset and her way, the way that she's looking at this case anytime soon.
By the book. Right.
But I mean, hey, if this does, like you said, if this does happen 5 times, I really hope that that we don't get to this point. But let's just say that the judge does the same thing that she did today additional times, where she says, okay, let's give it another 8 months. Scientology puts Valerie through another 5 days of interrogation, and they just keep coming back, continuing to not be anywhere near a result. I would hope that at some point along that process, the judge would realize, okay, Scientology's dragging this out. But right now, she's been through 5 days of it, and the judge doesn't seem to have changed her mind yet. So will that happen? Will that happen later? I don't know. I hope so.
Yeah. Justice for Valerie, as your friend Detective Aludo says, many criminal organizations have contracts of one kind or another. Scientology is committing to crimes against Valerie. It validates exactly, right? And it just cycles back to the thing is you wish the judge would ask for more information or look outside the box, because there's so much behind the scenes chicanery that goes on that other religions are not nearly as severe with. That's a tragedy. The one thing I want to shift gears, because I know you gotta get a bite to eat, and also cover part 2 of William Goode Streets, LA. Everybody was outside. I decided maybe you could go inside, so I went inside, and so want to give you a rundown. Jacob will give you a great rundown of part 2, but I'll ask him to analyze, and I'll give you a rundown of part 1. There's an attempted restraining order, if I'm not mistaken, from a man who part of Scientology, right? This is in February.
His name is Joey. And for those of you
Australian or something, or Brit, something like that.
One of the two. He's got an accent. But if you've been watching this protesting that's been happening in LA since the early days of the testing center, especially, this may be somebody who you'll recognize. Mindy Willens has also gone to the police about stalking by him. So it's not the first time that we're seeing him.
Interesting. So he's been in trouble himself, you're saying? Or no, he's taken the other person.
No, Mindy, I know,
Right.
has gone to the police, and I'm not sure
About
if this
him.
is something
Interesting.
about
Okay.
him, because he kept
Wow.
showing up in her neighborhood.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So hopefully all this will come out in part 2. Let me tell you about part 1. Part 1, Joey was on the verge of tears, could barely catch his breath. He talked about how he has multiple panic attacks multiple times a week, and how it was all William Street's LA's fault because of this. That he feels like his reputation is ruined and damaged, and that he can't function on the day-to-day because of the trauma that William Good has inflicted upon him. He also said he felt threatened by one of the Scientology people because he had a Manchester United jersey on, which apparently Manchester United fans are the most hostile.
Wait, he felt threatened by one of the Scientology people, or by
No,
one of the
by
protesters?
one of the protesters.
Got it.
Sorry, I should clarify that. By one of the protesters, because he had a Manchester United jersey on, and they're like the most vicious fans apparently, and he felt like that was a message to him, as if like, he was like wearing his Crip flag or something. It was a bizarre thing. And then finally there's this battle of semantics where Good's attorney was very on the ball about this, because he kept saying, well, I've gotten threats, and he kept saying, and worse, what he said was worse is that William would direct his followers to attack him and create this trauma. And then she's like, well, what? Can you give me an example? He said, well, for example, people I was getting directed to spit at. And he said, well, did William specifically say, did he direct anybody to spit on you? He said no. So it was a lot of the, well, and there was a big debate about what his followers are, because he says he's gotten a flood of messages. And the argument is, which is a valid argument, that William never told his 200,000 followers to all flood messages, and that they're essentially responsible for themselves. Yes, perhaps, and then the lawyer tried to zero in and say, well, any specific things that William directed any of the followers who are actually there in person, did they do anything? And again, the dude seems pretty stumped. So it's not looking good. He put on an emotional show. He started crying a little bit. And let's see, I'm looking at I think we pretty much got the crux of it, but trying to see if there's any other notable quotes I wrote down. Yeah, he said he was bullying. He was relentlessly bullied. And that he said that Streets made it his mission to attack him. So it was I don't think he has much of a case, guys. And William's attorney seems to know what she's doing, so I think she's ripping the guy apart. But yeah, Jacob will give you a good rundown of part 2.
Like I said, I didn't even know that this case was happening today.
Yeah,
I showed up this morning for Valerie's case, and I saw Solomon. I was like, hey, Solomon, are you here for Valerie's case? He was like, I'm here for Streets. Like, what's going on with Streets today? So yeah. I'm just still learning about all of the details of what's going on, but yeah, I'm appreciative that Dodge showed up to that first part of the hearing so that we could hear what's going on. And yes, hopefully I'll have some more information within a couple of hours.
Yeah. So I hope you like the recap, and guys, obviously subscribe to Jacob Harkey. Jacob spelled Jacob, right?
Harkey. That's
perfect.
Right.
And I'm gonna get the dog to bed, but Jacob will be there for part 2, and I'll probably see you guys later at Big Blue. So thank you for watching. Au revoir.
We'll see ya.
Cool. Thank you, sir.